Amid official narratives of cohesion and stability, signs of irritation are becoming increasingly visible in Russia, gradually spilling over. There are no mass protests, and the overwhelming majority still either support the government or prefer to remain silent. But a series of local protests across the country suggests something else: the silence in society is cracking. This was reported by the Russian independent resource We Can Explain. The reasons for the performances are very varied, and this is precisely what has become the distinctive feature of the current period. In several cities across the country, street musicians have begun openly performing songs by composers designated as foreign agents by Russian authorities. They are doing this in support of the St. Petersburg band StopTime, which the Kremlin has launched a crackdown on for its unfavorable songs about Swan Lake for Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. In other regions, Russians took to the streets due to domestic and economic problems. In Vladivostok, Novosibirsk, and Kamchatka, protests were held against the increase in recycling fees, which makes used Japanese cars virtually unaffordable. In Primorye, workers are striking after going months without wages. Protests against the Max messaging app, which the Kremlin is forcibly imposing on Russians, have taken place in Voronezh, Omsk, Novosibirsk, and Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. These protests don't attract thousands, but their regularity has become a new reality. In some places, an anti-war agenda is also being heard. In Perm, activists managed to hold a high-profile anti-war picket, an event that would have seemed almost impossible until recently. Residents of Kursk are demanding compensation for homes destroyed by the war, demonstrating that the consequences of the Kremlin's aggression are increasingly being felt within Russia itself. Sociology, despite strict controls, is also recording a shift in sentiment. Research shows growing war fatigue, a rise in pacifist views among young Russians, and a rapid exodus of young Russians from the sovereign internet. Amid constant pressure and propaganda, public frustration is building, reflected even in judicial statistics. The level of aggression and conflict is rising. A veritable cultural rebellion is unfolding in the country. People are reading books by writers labeled foreign agents or terrorists en masse. New publishing houses abroad are releasing hundreds of editions of cancelled authors, and readers are finding ways to bring them into Russia, circumventing restrictions. The most daring are demonstratively reading such books on the subway, revealing their covers. All these episodes are not signs of revolution, but rather evidence that the monolithic image of submission is beginning to falter. Discontent is still isolated and unsystematic, but it is becoming increasingly noticeable. Most importantly, Russia hasn't seen such a scale of dissent since the first months of a full-scale war. Ukraine signed an agreement to import natural gas from Greece on Sunday, as it braces to replace domestic gas production derailed by Russian attacks on key energy infrastructure ahead of a difficult winter. According to Associated Press at a joint briefing with Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis in Athens, Zelensky said the first gas deliveries from Greece will start in January. He added the deal reached with Athens also includes the transit of American liquefied natural gas from Greece, using the Mediterranean country's infrastructure. The gas will be supplied via pipelines from the northern Greek port of Alexandroupolis to the Ukrainian port of Odessa. In the last 2 weeks alone, Ukraine has faced massive attacks from Russia that inflicted severe damage to its energy infrastructure. In their talks on Sunday, Zelensky and Mitsotakis also discussed Greece's involvement in Ukraine's post-war reconstruction, mostly in construction, healthcare, digitalization and monument protection. Zelensky also made a pitch for Greece to acquire Ukrainian weaponry. Zelensky thanked Greece for its support of Ukraine's aim to join the European Union and its backing of sanctions against Russia. From Athens, Zelensky will make his 9th visit to Paris since the 2022 Russian invasion, for talks on Monday with President Emmanuel Macron on strengthening Ukraine's defenses ahead of the winter.
сталося, що з самого початку війни ви обрали бік України, значить закону і справедливості. Ми вам вдячні за всі ці майже 4 роки.
Και της πρέσβη των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών στην Ελλάδα, κυρίας Κίμπερλι Κιλφόιλ.
Ми відновлюємо щоразу, коли росіяни руйнують, але це дійсно вимагає часу, вимагає багатьох зусиль, обладнання. Що стосується газу, це вимагає імпорту газу, щоб компенсувати знищення росіянами нашого власного видобутку. Наші домовленості з Грецією сьогодні – це важлива частина великого енергетичного пакету, який ми підготували на цю зиму, щоб забезпечити Україну газом.
Πρόεδρε, φίλε Володимир, με χαρά σας υποδέχομαι και πάλι.
Постачання газу розпочнеться вже в січні, і це важливо, що в першому кварталі будуть реалізовані наші перші домовленості.
Πρόκοψαν και προσέφεραν εκεί. Οι σχέσεις μας συνεπώς έχουν...
Є домовленості, які відбулись наші двосторонні, а також є велика подяка і американським компаніям, Міністерству енергетики, президенту Сполучених Штатів Дональду Трампу за те, що ми зможемо отримати не тільки газ природний від Греції, а також через Грецію, тому що це дійсно така світова інфраструктура, яка є саме в Греції. Ми зможемо отримати енергетику зі Сполучених Штатів Америки. Ми вдячні народу Сполучених Штатів і президенту ще раз. Дякую тобі.
In Moscow, they began to realize that the special military operation is not developing according to Putin's plan. The Kremlin has issued a new manual in which it is said that negotiations with Trump and Ukraine are inescapable, and supporters of the continuation of the war to the borders of Poland are now called traitors. In fact, it turns out that for 4 years Russia fought in vain, and hundreds of thousands of Russians died in vain. Russia's economy is beginning to buckle. Businesses have been crippled by high interest rates. Government borrowing costs have soared, and Economy Minister Maxim Reshetnikov warned in June that the country was on the brink of a recession. Warnings are mounting over a potential avalanche of bad debt that could trigger a financial crisis. Small pockets of protests are emerging. Recently, hundreds of people gathered in St. Petersburg Square to sing an outlawed song calling for Putin to be overthrown. Meanwhile, Ukraine has been aggressively ramping up its drone attacks on Russian oil refineries, hammering the country's petrol supplies. Recently, the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation brought charges against 22 members of the anti-war committee of the Russian Federation, including Mikhail Khodorkovsky, for allegedly preparing a coup d'etat, violent seizure of power, and overthrow of the constitutional order in the country. With Vladimir Putin's rise to power, Russia has become a totalitarian state, and the dictator himself is increasingly wary of losing control of the country. Experts say the fear of a coup is a sign of the weakness of his regime. After the assassination of the leader of the Wagner PMC, Yevgeny Prigozhin, in 2023, which ended in his death, the Kremlin tightened security measures and control over military structures. Khodorkovsky, who spent 10 years in a Russian prison, emigrated to Europe and founded the Anti-War Committee in 2022. He denies any involvement in military actions against the Kremlin, a prime minister appointed by Putin, courts, and a parliament whose legitimacy is questionable. This is the reality of Russia, Khodorkovsky said. Analysts say Putin's fear may stem from the lack of a clear successor in the event of his death or removal from power. The Kremlin is trying to discredit the opposition to avoid possible destabilization. Angela Stent of Georgetown University emphasized, the regime wants to show that the West is trying to divide Russia. Moscow uses such information campaigns whenever tensions rise within the country. Separately, journalists note that Russia's economic weakness increases the risks for the ruling regime. According to Thomas Keating of the Royal Joint Institute for Defense Studies, it is this vulnerability that may push external players to take more active actions against Moscow. Former United States Ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst, said recently that the Russian dictator is paranoid and Putin himself is looking for enemies to strengthen his regime.